Hi everyone, welcome to Module 11. I thought I'd try a bit of a different approach here. And so I'm posting some slides. I realize that we're sort of not in class and this is asynchronous, right? And so the sort of discussion format, I'm sort of moving away from it a little bit. I certainly want your questions to continue to come because I want to still base what I'm doing on your questions, but I guess what I'm doing is something of a presentation these days without you being here. And so presentations can sometimes involve slides. And so let me know if this is a clearer format perhaps for you, a nicer format. What you'll see, I think, is that my slides are basically quotes from the text, right? So I guess the goal of this video, of these videos, are really to sort of give an example of using the text to answer some questions, and the questions are the questions that you're asking. This is super useful. Remember, for the midterm and the final, for the final that will come. And so that should help you with that. Now, I'm using Zoom. Hello, Alejandro. Hello, Alejandro.
Hello.
Hi. How are you doing?
Good. What about you?
Good. Did you have a question for me?
Oh, no. I was just checking up on if there was anyone joining, maybe they have a question that I had. But other than that, I think I'm doing pretty good.
Great. Oh, so okay, you're going to join us. I am recording this, just so you know. What I'm doing on here right now is I'm recording my response to the questions. You're absolutely welcome to sort of join us there. And if you have any comments or any questions, feel free to speak up. But otherwise, I'm sort of going to go about doing my presentation.
Okay, I got it. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'll probably stick through a bit, and then I'll see how it goes. And if I have any questions, I'll just let you know.
Brilliant. All right. Cool. Okay, so guerrilla warfare then. I was saying I've got some slides. This is all based on the Guerrilla Myth by Max Boot, which was our reading for this week in 160. And so we'll cover just a couple of questions. Actually, there's a bonus question at the end that we will sort of investigate a little bit. But the two main questions are going to be sort of to do with terrorism versus guerrilla warfare. What's the difference between them? I think that's an intriguing question for this reading, right, for Max Boot. And then we're going to deal more with the successive insurgencies. And you'll see that as we deal with those, we'll actually have a few other details and a few other, we'll sort of move around a little bit and cover some other topics related to those. First one then, terrorism versus guerrilla warfare, and it's inspired by this question here. So somebody asked here, is guerrilla warfare just another term for terrorism, right? Or is it its own independent type of warfare? Or perhaps originate from a past terrorist group? So I think, what's the difference between guerrilla warfare and terrorism? It's a great question. It's one that I think Max Boot actually doesn't really give us a very clear answer, but he does give us some clues to go on there. So we'll talk about that. In talking about this, we'll talk, of course, about what is guerrilla warfare, and that will be useful as well. So, okay, so again, what is guerrilla warfare then? How is it different? And I noticed in the text when I started looking for how he describes guerrilla warfare, I found that actually a lot of it might apply to both guerrilla warfare and terrorism. For example, here's one here. Guerrilla warfare is warfare without front lines. It's without starting and ending points. It's without uniforms. It's messy, it's bloody, it's hit and run raids. They target civilians oftentimes, Max Boot says. I think all of this might apply to terrorism as well. Right? And so, what is the difference? Interestingly as well, and I'm not sure if I've got a slide for this, well, it's not new. So it's not a new form of warfare. Now, terrorism, oftentimes we can trace terrorism to like the 1970s. That's when we start to see hijacking of planes and that sort of thing. 1970s is a common in the literature. It's common to talk about terrorism starting in the 1970s. But if we can't distinguish it from guerrilla warfare, and if we accept what Max Boot is saying, then we end up going quite far back in time, right? Max Boot talks about like the guerrilla warfare has been going on since the beginning of mankind, and for the last 5,000 years, it's hard. If we want to only count guerrilla warfare where it's guerrillas versus a conventional force, that's 5,000 years old. So certainly thousands of years old for Max Boot. Another thing he says in terms of it not being, not new. So he says not new. He says, look, tribal warfare has been going on. Mesopotamia, that's the first instance that Max Boot identifies as a clash between conventional forces and guerrilla warfare, guerrilla forces. He mentions American colonists, right? So that's quite a big step forward in time. The American colonists in the 18th century, also guerrilla, some of them at least, he says some of them employed guerrilla tactics. But importantly, he says this is the norm of armed conflict. We talk sometimes about guerrilla warfare as irregular warfare, right? As a sort of different from the norm. And then the norm of warfare, I suppose, then is two armies with uniforms, a start date, an end date, and clear who the enemy is, and protracted standing battles. Max Boot says that's not normal, right? That's unusual. So actually the norm is guerrilla. Guerrilla warfare is the norm of armed conflict. It's been going on forever. Tribal wars were guerrilla wars. The American Revolution was guerrilla warfare. Mesopotamia had it 5,000 years ago. That's the kind of warfare that we should be used to. And here's one of the questions I noticed, and it's not one of the main questions that I'm answering, but I noticed questions about, well, where is it happening today? I think actually we will cover something like that later on. But we've got here Mali, Algeria. This is all from the reading, but the French, I think, are fighting insurgents in Mali. Israel versus Hamas is an example of guerrilla warfare. The Taliban in Afghanistan against the United States, that's an example. Syria, the civil war that's going on in Syria, that's guerrilla warfare, right? And there's more. Mexico, drug cartels, drug gangs. Remember, we talked about them. I mentioned them on the last video when I was talking about terrorism, and I was saying how I would discount them as terrorists because, they don't have a political goal. It doesn't seem to me like their main goal is political, so I would disagree that they're terrorists. But by that same standard, could they then be guerrillas if they're not terrorists? And again, this is where it starts to get quite fuzzy between the distinction between guerrillas and terrorists. Colombia and the FARC, again, right? FARC certainly is a terrorist organization according to the United States. Max Boot's identifying them as guerrillas. African country versus the Lord's Resistance Army. I don't know as much about the Lord's Resistance Army. I know very little about it, but if I was a betting man, I might bet that the United States has them as a terrorist organization. So, but they're being cited by Max Boot as a guerrilla group. And here's sort of the final word, I suppose, from Max Boot. This is where he really addresses this question of, well, okay, how do we distinguish between them? He says, terrorist movements are the close cousins of guerrilla warfare. So he's not wanting to distinguish them too much in his reading. There is one, and I don't think I've put it on a slide here actually, but there is one part of the reading that for me, I base my distinction on whenever I teach this class, whenever I teach this particular reading. And it's on page 138. And it says this it's at the bottom of point 2. So point 2 is that guerrilla warfare is the form of conflict universally followed by the weak. Okay, not an Eastern way of war. At the bottom of that section, it says this, it says, their experiences suggest that few people have ever chosen guerrilla warfare voluntarily. It is the tactic of last resort for those too weak to create regular armies. Likewise, terrorism is the tactic of last resort for those too weak to create guerrilla forces. So that might be the only strong distinction that I can make out, and And in terms of a strong distinction, it's more of a continuum, right? How weak are you, right? If you're very strong, if you're in a nation state, you've probably got conventional forces. If you are weaker than that, if you're too weak to have conventional forces, then you might have a guerrilla force, right? And we will talk more about this later, actually. If you're too weak to have a guerrilla force, then you'll have terrorism. You'll be terrorists, right? You'll use terrorist tactics. So when we talked about terrorist tactics last time, so then I think about so then it might be easy to identify the different guerrillas and separate them from terrorists by like their strength. Right? That's the sort of the best way that I've come up with from Max Boot to do that. But however much we try and distinguish them, we have to deal with the fact that for Max Boot, terrorist movements are the close cousins of guerrilla movements. The second one, then, the second question is sort of looking at the success of insurgencies, and it was I went that direction because of this question, which says insurgencies have been getting more successful since 1945, but they still lose most of the time. That's a quote from Max Boot. If they still lose most of the time, how can you explain the rise of certain groups like ISIS? What are they doing then? If they're unsuccessful, right? If guerrilla warfare is unsuccessful, why is anybody doing it? And there's support for this in the book, right? Max Boot tells us guerrillas have seldom achieved their aims. And he has a look and he says, look, I've counted, says Max Boot, I've made a database, and in my database, I've counted 443 insurgencies since 1775. What's that, a couple every year or something like that? Insurgencies since 1775. He says, of those, about a quarter, almost exactly a quarter, have succeeded. So if you're going to adopt insurgency tactics, and I'm using insurgencies and guerrilla warfare, I'm using them in the same to mean the same thing here as Max Boot does. 25.2% are succeeding. You've got a one in four chance of succeeding as a guerrilla, right? So that might be, that might not be bad odds, right? And then he says, actually, look, it might be getting more successful since 1945, although as this number, right, this figure of 39.6% of post 1945 insurgencies that succeeded. But he says that's of the insurgencies that have been completed, right? But what if we count the ones that are going on today as failed, right? Because they haven't achieved their aims yet. If they're still going on, then that drops down to like 23.2%, which is, so it looks like maybe the percentage hasn't really changed, right? It's only that there's a lot of insurgencies that are going on that have not yet been resolved. But the ones that have been resolved in favor of insurgencies more at a higher rate than before 1945. So that's an interesting figure. I mean, if we go by that figure, that's 4 in 10. Is that now an answer to the question? I was like, why do ISIS exist? If they've got a 1 in 4 chance, now they have a 4 in 10, right? A 2 in 5 chance of success. Is that why they exist? Is that why they're giving it a go? If not, there's this other point here that Max Boot makes. Even if guerrillas do not achieve their ultimate goals, they can sometimes win concessions. So if that percentage, then I'm assuming because Max Boot came up with the percentage because he's explaining this, if we've got 25% of them then are achieving all of their goals, right? And then that's a 1 in 4 chance. And then if we have on top of that other groups, and he mentions in here the PLO and the IRA, who haven't achieved their ultimate goals, and I think the IRA got quite a lot of what they were looking for. Even if I can sort of see why he would say that they haven't got everything, they've got quite a lot. And in that sense, then there might be more motivation, more of a justification, if you like, for forming guerrilla movements, for using guerrilla tactics. In that, even if we, even if we're not one of the 25% that gets everything that we want, we might get a lot of what we want, and so that's a higher likelihood that we'll be in one of those two groups. And here, this brings us back, I think, to the end of the last question, right, and sort of the beginning of this question. And this is again from Max Boot. Few have ever chosen guerrilla warfare voluntarily. It is the tactic of last resort. So we've got a couple of ways we could go with the question, right? If we had that question in the midterm or in the final, we've got two different ways we could go with it. And we could maybe combine the two in some way. But one way we could go is to say, look, there's some success there, right? If you have 1 in 4 chance of getting everything that you want, why wouldn't you try? If it's a 40% chance, why wouldn't you try? Also, if you try and you don't get everything you want, there's an even higher likelihood that you'll get some of what you want, right? And so that's another reason why you might, how we might explain why ISIS exists and other guerrilla movements. So that's one way, but this is another way we can go. We can say, look, and you can see that you can combine it quite easily with the last one, but look, it's not that they want to be guerrillas, right? Of course, they want to be a state, especially the Islamic State. It's in the name. So they want to be a state. They want a conventional army, but frankly, they're too weak to have a conventional army. They're too weak to pull that off. If they were, and Max Boot doesn't go into this, but I'm sort of extrapolating from what he's saying. If they were to wear a uniform, if they were to have bases, identified bases that are out in the open with flags hoisted on the mast, if they were openly recruiting people and dressing them in uniform and sending them around the place, now they become very visible, very easily targeted. Now that's okay if you're strong, right? If you have a well-trained, well-equipped, strong military, then yeah, that's okay to sort of put badges on them and identify them as military. But if you're weak, you really can't do that because you're going to lose a lot of guys. And you're not going to be able to sustain any kind of a fighting force. And so guerrilla warfare then it's not a voluntary, it's not what we want. It's sort of the second best thing. We're going to use guerrilla tactics. We're not going to wear uniforms. We're going to keep our people under the radar. We're going to recruit in secret. We're not going to announce to anybody where we are or where we're training or what we're up to. We're going to keep it quiet. We're not going to fight along the lines that conventional forces would fight, right? Having well-defined territorial advances or well-defined territory at all, because if we do that, if we announce to everybody where we are and what we're up to, we're not going to last very long. So we're going to do hit and run attacks. We're going to do sneak attacks and get ourselves out of there because we can't afford to lose too many men. And the equipment that we have, the resources that we got mean that in a protracted battle with anybody, we would lose a lot of resources, right? So that's why it's a tactic of last resort. Of course, there are some then, according to Boot, and we don't know enough about this, I don't think, from what we've read, but there's another group who are too weak now to have use guerrilla tactics, and then they have to resort to terrorist tactics, which we also read about last time. Evidence for this he offers are tribal peoples such as the Turks, Arabs, and Mongols. He says they employed guerrilla tactics in their rise to power, but once they became powerful, once they had empires, they turned to conventional forces. And he says that's the proof, right? If when they became strong that have carried on with guerrilla tactics, then we would say, well, sometimes guerrilla tactics are the right way to go. And strong actors and nation states use guerrilla tactics. But for Boot, no, everybody that's become powerful using guerrilla tactics has switched when they could to conventional forces. And this brings us to this sort of bonus question that I found here that I was interested in. Is there any, and this is the last sort of question that we'll think about, is there any benefits for powerful nations to utilize guerrilla warfare? How can various nations use guerrilla warfare to their advantage? So Max Boot definitely wants to tell us no. But on the other hand, we have definitely recent evidence of this. I think the case that I'm thinking about is Russia, right? With their little green men, right? Those guys who were fighting in the Ukraine, who were helping and supporting insurgents in Ukraine against their government, against the Ukrainian government. The Russians said, look, they're not our military, they're not our special forces. Everybody else suspected that they were indeed Russia's special forces, Russian special forces, but they said that they weren't. And so if we for a minute entertain the notion that maybe Russia wasn't telling us the truth, and maybe that we were right, that they were Russian operatives, right, Russian special forces, that are involved in leading and organizing and helping an insurgency, but doing so as insurgents, right? In other words, without uniforms. They had sort of green clothes, right, uniforms, but they didn't have any badges on, right? They didn't have any identifying insignia. It gets a little bit cloudy, because when you think of them, if we accept that they are Russian special forces, then they are trained in such a way. Well, they're trained in conventional warfare. They're probably trained in guerrilla warfare as well. And maybe all special forces have that ability, right, to operate behind enemy lines, to operate surreptitiously undercover, to sort of hit targets and get out of there quickly. And that might be the key, maybe, right? Special forces might be the guerrilla warfare, right? Might be what might be at least close enough for us to say, yeah, there are some benefits for powerful nations to utilize guerrilla warfare. And why do they do that, right? And when they have conventional forces, if what Max Boot is saying, right, the conventional forces are always superior for the powerful nations, and guerrilla tactics are the poor man's choice. That mightn't be the case if we look at Russia, and then from there I went to like special forces generally. But let's go back to Russia for a second in Ukraine. Why are they doing that, right? Why are they using these, assuming that they are, why are they using these undercover and claiming that they're guerrillas and claiming that they're not really our forces, right? They're guerrilla forces. And part of it is certainly the deniability, right? The irresponsibility. And when I say irresponsibility, I mean that Russia as a nation state is attempting to not be responsible for the actions of who might well be, right, their own agents, right, their own special forces. And so that would be the advantage in that particular case. That'd be one of the big advantages, is that you have very well trained troops who are helping your foreign policy, helping you to forward your foreign policy agenda, but doing so in a way where you can deny that it's you doing it, right? And then that allows you to really get yourself involved in things that maybe you otherwise shouldn't be involved in. And of course, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking of all sorts of special operations, special forces, intelligence agencies that have sort of paramilitary arms to them that are involved in military operations. So it looks like actually that, in terms of a bonus question, and Max Boot doesn't talk about it, and Max Boot seems to this would be a great question for him, right? This was undermine parts of his argument, but yeah, it's a good question. It's something interesting to consider, and I'm going to leave it there for now. I don't have any slides that use images today, but that's it for now. I hope you're doing well with and staying safe and staying healthy now. We're progressing towards the final exam in this, and there'll also, remember, be a retake if you would like to, an optional retake of the midterm. These questions are going to be sort of used as a basis for the questions that you'll see on the final. And so if you do have any questions about what we've talked about today, about Max Boot's article, do feel free to get in contact with me, either by email or finding me here on Zoom, where I'm recording this now. All right. Thanks, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Hi, Alejandro. Any questions or anything?